So you need to understand, or I would say, firstly, let's ensure that the APIs are well designed, they are secure, they evolve to meet the user needs, that is the business and the developer. Because each of these stages, they involve specific roles and responsibilities to ensure the APIs are meeting the business objectives and they provide a great developer experience. And let's explore these. This is a pyramid, and I'm going to start from the bottom to mention each of these stages of the API lifecycle. It starts from planning and design to development and testing to deployment and publishing to management and operation. And then you have the remaining concepts of monitoring and analytics, versioning and deprecation, and finally on retirement. I'm going to take each of these ones. And the reason why I started from the bottom up is that's really how things go, right? So let's start with planning and designing. And I'm going to use the concept of roles and responsibilities in this case because it is super important that everyone in the business understands what their role and responsibility is, but with a focus on PMs. Now, in the planning and design phase, it is super important that the PM knows their responsibilities in this process. And it is very unique. Every business has a right to say, well, for the PM role, I want the PM to also be an API designer. Or I want the PM to be an individual contributor that fully understands the role of a PM in an API lifecycle, the designing of an API, the architecture of an API, the security constraints of an API. So essentially, I'm looking for an API specialist. That is well within the right of a business. However, commonly speaking, these roles are very different. So, what I'm trying to say here is there are different individuals and different roles that fulfill each of these. So, a PM will define the API's purpose, the value proposition, the target users, that is, developers, partners, internal teams, whatever it is. It would also align the APIs with with the broader business strategy. It would also conduct market research to understand user needs and competition in this planning and design phase. It would also develop a proper product roadmap, and it will prioritize the product features based off of the business requirements or where the business is trying to go to. The role of the API designer includes designing the endpoints, request and response models, data structures, addressing different security, scalability, and performance considerations in the design phase. A security specialist will define data protection and encryption mechanisms. The pure output of this planning and design phase, noted by the PM, the API designer or architect, the security specialist, is three things. One, what is the roadmap and success metrics? Two, security and compliance requirements. Three, what type of API specification are we going to use to deploy this API? The next step is development and testing. Now, at this stage, most times, based off of whatever the business is, or however the business chooses to interpret these rules, the developer would implement the API following the design specification agreed, ensure the code is modular, it is maintainable, it is scalable. Obviously, you need to collaborate with the backend teams to integrate with existing systems and databases because the APIs cannot work single-handedly. At the beginning of these sessions and these lessons, I did say the concept of an API. An API enables two systems or two backend systems to speak to one another. You're essentially saying your API send instructions between two different systems, and enable them to sort of exchange information between one another. Now, in order for you to do that, it needs to be integrated within that process. It cannot work on its own. The APIs are somewhat useless on their own without these two systems. That's where they function. That's where they come alive, right? The key output of the development and testing process is a developed API, test reports on that API. So functional testing, security testing, performance testing, load testing in that sense. You also want to have a staging environment and a user acceptance for user acceptance, right? Testing, whereby you are able to just test that API. The next point is on deployment and publishing of the API. Now, the roles and responsibility here is very dependent on the DevOps engineer, right? Security teams and the API product manager. Now, the API product manager here will finalize the API pricing and access tiers if we're monetizing that API. Because really, remember, as we said in previous lessons, the concept is that we are tying these APIs to business goals and value propositions. So if we have a value proposition, we know this is a market need, and we also know, well, this is where the business is trying to go. We're able to tie a pricing and an access tier to that to say the pricing is to meet that business need, and the positioning of this API is to make sure that we're executing on that business goal. All right. The value proposition is always clear at this point because, I mean, the homework must have been done at this point. Next point is that you need to prepare the developer portal with documentation. So, develop documentation, API keys, sandbox environments so that developers can test the APIs. The key outputs of your deployment and publishing phase is the API deployed to production, API documentation published on the developer portal, developer access. That is, the developer needs to access your onboarding user guides and your API keys, right? The next point is management and operation. Now, in management and operation, you have the API operations team and support teams. Their outputs in the management and operation of your API is one, real-time monitoring and alerting system, because you need to monitor those APIs to be able to understand how it's being used. So the how, the why, the what. You need to understand how it's being used, why it's being used in certain use cases, right? And whatever the problem is, you need to be able to spot it, right? And once you understand the different use cases, that is the how, then you can sort of basically say to the development teams, well, this is how these systems are used, or these different businesses are using this system. Do you want to build for this use case as well to explore that market? And obviously, that's where the PM comes into play, where they do some market research on that. And obviously, an alerting system where you want to be able to know where it reached a certain threshold, whether that threshold is an error rate or whatever type of rate that looks like. The next point is active developer support and issue resolution process. This is a very key important part of management and operation of your APIs. Because when users, whether that's even a common user like you or I, or developers do not feel like they are getting responses to their questions, they lose interest in your product, right? And issue resolution, you can measure this by how many tickets they are creating. You can measure this by how many questions are being asked on your developer forums and things of that nature. And how the speed at which you're resolving those problems are super important as well. So the API operations teams needs to monitor the API uptime, performance, and health in real time, whilst the support team is providing support to developers who may experience issues or need guidance on API usage. This is super important. Finally, to drive home this point on management and operation, The support team and the operation teams need to ensure that smooth operation by resolving any technical issues or outages within a time frame. They must also respond to any API related incidents, bugs reported by either the internal team or the external team, dependent on who's using this service. So that's pretty much it in terms of management and operation. Now, when it comes to monitoring and analytics, this is super important. That is one for the API product manager, for the analytics team, and for the operations team. Now, for the API PM, you need to analyze API usage metrics. That is the number of API calls, response time, developer engagement, to understand to understand the trends and the user behavior. I had mentioned this before. It is super important for you to understand the trends, for you to understand the user behaviors, for you to understand the number of calls, so that whenever anything drops or goes higher, you can tell a story as to why that is happening. You need to use insights to make informed decisions about API improvements or new features. If you don't have this monitored, if you don't have your analytics, you are already falling behind on your product. So it is super important that you have this. The analytics team or the business intelligence team need to track performance metrics like latency, error rates, server response times. Those are important metrics, and there are more. So you need to also collect, they need to also collect and analyze business metrics related to the API monetization of the usage. That is revenue to API subscriptions, right? The key outputs here is API usage and performance reports, actionable insights for improving the APIs, and user experience. So you need to come out of this process, which is a continuous process. One, insight. So every meeting that the API PM has with the analytics team or the operations team needs to come out with. We need to have an insight. We need to have insights as to what has happened in the last week, month, year in terms of these APIs. We need to also have those reports that are ongoing consistently. And we need to also basically say, how do we improve this for the future based off of what we are seeing? Who do we need to speak to? Who do we need to have conversations with? What are the new product lines that can be built based off of the data that we are seeing on our system? And how can we validate that information? And this is where, as PMs, data comes very important. Obviously, you have this as quantitative data, whereby you're able to see behavioral patterns. It is also important that you have qualitative data in the sense that you're able to have conversations with your customers by building things like or setting up things like focus groups, having personal one-to-one interviews, thanking the user for using your service, but also asking them based off of the concepts that you have been able to see, validating that your ethos is actually correct. The next point is on versioning and deprecation. Now, as an API PM, your role and responsibility here is to, number one, plan and communicate new API versions. You want to explain changes and improvements to the users. So you need to communicate what the value proposition is to the user and tell the user, well, based off of X, this is why. What you need to also be able to sell that change to the user. By selling that change, what I mean is you need to be able to say, well, based off of how this used to be used in the past. For example, this service used to enable you to make 240 calls per day. We have been able to build this in a robust way whereby you can now make an infinity of calls per day. That improves that user experience and tells them, well, yeah, this is exciting because we're limited before, now we're unlimited. And it makes them even want to do that version changing. Now, the API PM must also be able to manage the transition between versions. That is, you need to ensure backward compatibility where possible, which this is super important. You need to also communicate deprecation timelines to users and developers, providing enough time for migration. Most times, deprecation process should take at the very least 6 months to a year. Mostly when you're trying to when you're trying to transition from an already in use API. Say, for example, you have a payments API or an FX pricing API, and various banks or various customers depend on this. My advice is use the rules between 1 year, 6 months to 1 year, whereby you are constantly communicating with your customers and helping them with the process, helping them with the timelines. And there are different ways you can communicate this. Now, the key outputs of this versioning and deprecation process is that there is a new version of the API would come out. The deprecation notices and migration guides must also come out, whereby you're sharing this with your customers, all your customers. You're also sharing timelines. You're sharing the phases of how this will go. And I'll speak a bit more about this when we speak about versioning as a topic. Retirement. Now, this is the end of life for an API. So the API PM needs to communicate the API end of life to users well in advance, including the retirement date and recommended alternatives for the user. So you need to ensure the business impact of retiring the API is very minimal. So you need to ensure that you are notifying every key stakeholder or your partner to make sure that they do not have any disruption in their services. The developers in this case need to safely retire the APIs from production when you're but make sure that you're ensuring that no data is lost or critical services disrupted within this entire process. The key outputs of your retirement process must always be the API is decommissioned, but more importantly, all stakeholders are informed and transitioned to alternatives of that API or that service. Now, with this being the case, this is the end of life. I've been able to speak about all of the processes from the beginning of the pyramid to the end, whereby um, planning and designing, and at the end, we're talking about the retirement of the product.